Okay, and now I would like to call upon Prasenjit to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker.
Okay, we've already eaten 2 minutes into Sanjay's time, so I don't want to do that for much longer. And Sanjay, as is well known, and it's a well-known sort of phrase, needs no introduction. I, for one, have certainly introduced him at least twice before in very major circumstances. Sanjay Subrahmanyam is, but just to remind you, where is all my stuff? He is at present the professor and Irving and Gene Stone Endowed Chair in the Social Sciences at UCLA. Very recently, last year, he also was elected to a chair in early modern global history at the Collège de France in Paris. And these are sort of, he's now covered with more glory than when I introduced him the last two times. So, but I just want to say that Sanjay is certainly one of the most capacious historians I know in terms of breadth, in terms of archives, in terms of languages, and he covers many topics, and he covers Eurasia by land and by sea, and we will be hearing from him today on some of these things. There are things that I read that have nothing to do with each other that I occasionally have to look up Sanjay for. Once I was reading something on Imarat and Tijarat. You wrote that article, did you? Okay. In somewhere in the Middle East. What empire was that? All across the Middle East, different empires. And then, of course, his very well-known book on Vasco da Gama, which is also a beautiful read. So he is not as far as I know, unless he was also that, a traditional historian of science, but I can really think of no one better to put the questions of science, the history and philosophy of science, in a more relevant and important historical context. Thank you, Sanjay. Will you move here? And you have about 45 minutes, so we can have also good time for discussion. I'll let you know 5 minutes in advance.
Thank you, Prasenjit, and thank you to the organizers, the very complex structure of organization that we've already heard described and discussed in the preceding minutes, for having invited me for this meeting. It seems unnecessary for me to add my apologies to those of everybody else for not being a historian of science. What I can say is that I have been, I think, a neighbor, perhaps, I hope, a good neighbor to historians of science, now in a variety of distinct institutional contexts, which began with my friendly neighboring relations with the historians of science of the Centre Coiré in Paris, one of whom is present here, but also others who are not here. It continued with my relations, also very positive, with historians of science in Oxbridge. And now, of course, one of my two positions has as its neighbors Norton Wise, Ted Porter, Mary Terrell, Margaret Jacob. So you can see that I have a certain number of historians of science in my neighborhood, but you will also notice that these names that I mentioned to you, all of them historians of science, but none of them historians of Asia in this particular instance, in the case of UCLA. Now, that of course is the center of part of what we're going to discuss today and tomorrow, which is what is the relationship between history and philosophy of science and the question of Asia. But I want to actually raise the question to a higher level of generality today. And you will notice that I have slightly, in fact, modified my title from the one which I gave, which I realized was an error. So the title I had given was Beyond the Civilization Paradigm, and I've changed it actually to Beyond the Civilizations Paradigm. And you'll see it's not a coincidence. And what I wanted to talk about then has to do with the Indian Ocean between the 15th and the end of the 18th centuries, but I'll be ranging somewhat further and wider than that, and also methodologically I'll be ranging into areas which enter into areas such as those of those congenital trespassers, but shouldn't they be trespassed on sometimes themselves, which is to say, the anthropologists.
Thank you.
So, it's certainly now not a unexpected idea that thinking about the global history of a number of different categories of knowledge is not a project which has a single setting. The time is long gone when the only global histories that could be done from Europe. And it is now fairly common, for instance, and many of you, for instance, who know the very wide and quite controversial work of people like, let's say, Harley and Woodward on cartography would be aware. It's now fairly widely accepted that there are many different points of perspective. There are many different, for instance, possible cartographies of the world. And for instance, it is also a well-known fact that if you go to an area which is now well explored, fairly well explored, by scholars such as Ahmad Kara Mustafa or more recently Giancarlo Casale, that the history, for instance, of Ottoman cartography is a very interesting and quite rich one, starting certainly from the late 15th to early 16th century, famously, for instance, with the map of the Admiral Piri Reis, who wound up unfortunately being executed in Cairo in the middle of the 16th century, but before that had put together in his famous Kitab al-Bahriya a version of the world which was much less extensive than this one, which comes to us essentially from the 17th century and which has more to do with the work of Haji Khalifa, and which eventually, of course, also becomes a part of the first attempts on the part of Ottomans to enter into the world of print, which is the famous attempts linked with the, I would believe, Hungarian renegade Ibrahim Mutaferrika. And we know then, actually, from these kinds of materials that, and this is a point to which I will come back insistently, that there is no sense in talking about an Ottoman cartography or an Islamic cartography as if it exists on its own. It exists clearly in a situation where the Ottomans, partly because of the nature of their personnel, so you have a Hungarian renegade, you have printers who are traveling the Mediterranean, and for a variety of other reasons, the Ottomans, for instance, are reading other people's maps. We know that, for instance, Haji Khalifa reads the Jesuit accounts of Japan and therefore is the first person in the Ottoman world to actually have a province-by-province map of Japan, which he is able to produce then by the middle decades of the 17th century. So it's actually useful to think about these as points of perspective, but not as sealed-off, silo-like units. And this is, of course, precisely one of the problems that I want to actually center on, which is what happens when you actually address the problem of the globe through the paradigm of civilizations. Now, of course, the word civilization is very much in the air. And it is very much in use, especially in the kinds of books which I don't know about the rest of you, but which I'm constantly being contacted 6 or 7 times a year by various sorts of agents and publishers who wish to actually tell me that if I want to write an academic book, it should be under 250 pages long, but if I want to write a trade book, it should be over 750 pages. And these books are all meant to address the reading public, which apparently does most of its purchasing in train stations and the airport bookstores. And these are the kinds of books which then get very widely reviewed. Many of you would have certainly seen reviews, not always complimentary, of the book on the right over here, which is the Harvard historian Neil Ferguson's Civilization, the West and the Rest, where he tells us, of course, in his characteristic style, how the West triumphs through its use of something called killer apps. And on the left, you find a somewhat more serious piece of work written by a classicist at Stanford, Ian Morris, who worked on the archaeology of ancient Greek cities, but then has gone on also to write this book, somewhat more modest on the part of the West, which says why the West rules for now, because he admits that this alleged dominance of the West over other civilizations is not eternal. He believes it will come to an end by the end of the 21st century, and he actually thinks that, again, there is a distinct possibility that by the time that which will dominate, as the West dominated once, is Chinese civilization. And he actually has a set of exceedingly interesting but completely fictitious numbers on the basis of which he's built these enormous indices of comparative global development of different civilizations from the time of Thucydides, if not before. He actually is able to put numbers on things such as energy capture in ancient Africa at the time of Great Zimbabwe, which most of us would consider beyond our modest capacities. Now, these kinds of works that exist are a part today then of a common discursive vocabulary, which not all of us share. Some of us are more or less violently opposed to it, but at any rate, it is very widely out there. And of course, in turn, this has something to do with a very famous, or if you like, infamous book which was published in the early 1990s, which actually tried to produce a cartography of civilizations in the world, and the cartography then, as you will all recognize, looked like this, with some relatively weak and some relatively strong concepts over here. So this was a world which can be entirely divided into civilizations, with the possible exception of Antarctica, which apparently has an as yet indeterminate status over here. So you have then the category of Western Christendom, which covers the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of course much of Western Europe, with the line, of course, being drawn where the blue part starts is where Orthodox Christianity begins. That is to say, the two versions of it, whether it's the Russian Orthodoxy or Greek Orthodoxy and its variants. So you have that clear distinction over there first. Then, of course, you have Islamdom, as some people like to call it, the world of the Muslims, which runs all the way then from West Africa through to not only the western part of the island of New Guinea, but to its eastern part, which is an interesting matter which some of the population there would be no doubt puzzled by. But you have this very large space then. You have the space of Buddhism, you have the space of Hinduism, you have the Cynic space, you have the Japanese space, and then you have, of course, these two other weak concepts. One is sub-Saharan Africa, which clearly, as you can see, doesn't have the same status or the same reasoning behind it as a category. And finally, of course, you have Latin America, which is in the Western Hemisphere, is an area which was colonized by Europe, but which has, and this is actually the crucial matter, the somewhat unfortunate disqualification that it is mostly made up of Catholics. Now, this is actually the problem which is posed, and this is the reason why it must be marked by a different color, which is because actually it has people who belong to a different religion. Now, apparently, if you're European and Catholic, this is not a disqualification. It's because clearly France and Italy and Spain and Portugal do not have this issue, but when this Catholicism gets exported, there is some problem with it. Now, of course, as you will all be aware, the person who put forward this point of view was Samuel Huntington, the late Samuel Huntington, a well-known political scientist, and you see here three versions of it. The debate, it was initially an article published in Foreign Affairs in 1992. I'm told by my friends in Chinese studies that it was very quickly translated into Chinese. And of course, you have if you actually look it up on the internet, you have various versions of it. And this actually on the right over here is something which I find particularly interesting, which is the Urdu translation. which is actually called Tehzeebon Ka Tasaddum. And which Tehzeebon Ka Tasaddum, as those of you who know Urdu or its related languages would realize, is this interesting translation of it, because this would normally be translated as the collision of cultures. Right? So the clash of civilizations becomes the collision of cultures, which is, of course, not entirely unprecedented. The German translation actually has, I believe, as its title, Kampf der Kulturen, which perhaps was more familiar to a German public already. So you have this work. Now let me just remind you of one or two little things about this work. Many of you would have read not only of it, but surely too much about it. But I want to remind you of one or two things about it. First is that this was actually written by Huntington as a response to one of his own students. And this student was Francis Fukuyama. So Fukuyama had somewhat earlier in the post-1989 phase written this famous book on the end of history, which was, of course, a very, very millenarian title, but it was actually meant precisely in that millenarian sense of a sort of an eternal peace of the market which was going to reign now that the clash of the Cold War was over. And Huntington, ever the realist, was reminding his student that it's not because the Cold War is over that conflicts are over. In fact, he was essentially arguing that there is this sort of substratum of long-standing, deep resentments which are going to merely re-emerge from under that carapace, and that there is really no cause for optimism in our view of the future of world history. Now, I want to actually make a very simple point to start with, which is that, in fact, no matter how much has been said, which is negative about Huntington, the really important point about him is that what he was saying was not original, was actually a very widely shared point of perspective, which many, many people actually believed but did not articulate as clearly as he did. As the extreme right-wing politician in France, Jean-Marie Le Pen, once put it, il disait tout haut ce que les gens pensaient tout bas. He said out aloud what a lot of people actually believed in their heart of hearts. Right? I want to just give you one example of this. This is an attempt to actually build a world cartography, a positive world cartography on the part of two extremely well-known social scientists who actually argue that this is the way we should conceive of the world for the purposes of social scientific analysis. And you will notice that despite the fact that there are some distinctions, right? For instance, the fact that Central Asia exists here as a region, whereas it is absent in the Huntington cartography, and that Melanesia and Micronesia and Polynesia similarly have a place. Actually, this is quite a similar cartography, and this comes from Wigan and Lewis's myth of continents. Right? So, in fact, it is not the case that what Huntington was building was something which was not widely shared. It was actually quite widely shared. And we have to ask ourselves, for instance, why Wigan and Lewis would, for instance, want to make such a sharp distinction between what they call North America and Ibero-America. Why would they actually, of course, they have this category which is called Southwest Asia and North Africa, but this is just pussyfooting. This is just saying something very complicated for saying what they really believe, which is the world of Islam. Right? Now, of course, you will notice that they do distinguish between that part of the world and, let us say, Southeast Asia. But there is a family resemblance which is troubling and much too strong to be set aside. Now, let me just very quickly remind you then of the other part of this Huntington idea, which is that not only are there these civilizations, but these civilizations are characterized by more or less strong conflicts, and that these are structurally determined conflicts. So remember that the idea is that the thicker the line, the deeper the conflict in the relationship. So, for instance, the West and the Cynic civilization have a deep conflict. The West and Islam have a very deep conflict. Africa and Islam apparently have a conflict, which is quite interesting. Hinduism and Islam apparently have a conflict. But apparently the West and Latin America have only a weak conflict. What is really extraordinary is that China and Japan apparently have a very weak conflict. So you have these ideas of more or less strong conflicts, and the idea is that, of course, these will also eventually give rise to possible alliances between these different civilizational blocs. Now, as I said, the important thing, of course, is that Huntington was hardly terribly original in either putting forward this thing or indeed in the civilizational categories that he used. So where, in fact, did his civilizational categories come from? Now, of course, a good place to begin is Max Weber. And we can go back to Weber writing in the 1910s, where he actually has a very clear notion of what the effective civilizational categories are. So there is Christianity, there is Islam, there's Judaism, of course. But then beyond that, there is what he calls Confucianismus, Taoismus, Hinduismus, and Buddhismus. So these are all these categories which for him are the effective categories on the basis of which, the building blocks on the basis of which comparative history and comparative sociology is to be done. And of course, remember that Weber is also responsible for this idea of a radical line to be drawn within Europe itself, indeed within Germany itself, where the northern Protestant part of Germany and the southern Catholic part of Germany are regarded as highly different, with very different trajectories. And of course, this is also an idea which then reproduces itself in a number of national histories in Europe. For instance, historians of France are very well aware of the use, both conscious and subconscious, of something which is often called the Geneva-Saint-Malo line, which is the line which allegedly divides France into two parts, a northern part which is progressive, more oriented towards Protestantism, and a southern part which is more oriented towards the Mediterranean, more naturally backward, less likely to be transformed demographically, etc., etc. These are many of the habits which go back to Jules Michelet at least, and certainly before that. So Weber is clearly there as a presence. This is part of the Vulgate from which this is being drawn. But in fact, when you think about it, these ideas and these concepts go back much earlier than that. And there has been some reflection on this matter on the part of a number of different writers. Famously, the French linguist Émile Benveniste wrote an article, it was a sort of a Kozelekine article, avant la lettre, which was about the idea of civilization and how far does it go back. And Benveniste actually made the argument that the term civilization actually entered common usage probably in the 1750s or the 1760s, that the first person to use it was Mirabeau, and that subsequently it became spread even before the French Revolution. It was then adopted by British writers. He has other people writing after him, for instance, have pointed to great hesitation on the part of Samuel Johnson, for instance, on whether or not civilization as opposed to civility was a real word, whether it should actually be admitted into the language, into proper language. But in this whole long discussion, and I believe that the last substantial salvo in this discussion is by the Australian political scientist Brett Bowden, who has two books on the idea of civilization, including one on civilization as a critical concept in political science. Now, these writers, I think, don't, however, make enough of the distinction with which I began, which is the distinction between the idea of civilization and the idea of civilizations. Now, why is this important? It's important to us because, of course, if you are talking about civilization in the singular, you are actually talking about one of two things. You are actually either talking about some kind of a developmental horizon. So, for instance, if we go back to what all of us are taught as children, you will remember that we are all taught about the existence of five ancient civilizations located in disparate parts of the world, and then some debates on whether there was contact, for instance, between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization and so on. And usually, all that civilization means over here is a developmental schema in which urbanism has arisen. That's all that it means, right? So from agrarian, non-urbanized societies, we have moved to urbanized societies. So there is a simple two-part division over there. And more generally, we could think of, and this is probably the sense in which Mirabeau was also thinking about it, we could think of civilization then as simply distinguishing those who have crossed a certain cultural threshold from those who have not crossed a certain cultural threshold. So it's in fact a kind of a reflection even on one's own past. It's not actually necessarily a device for othering in a geographical sense. It's something which could simply be a reflection on where one is and where one was. Now, this kind of notion, of course, is the reason why, for many people, civilization in the singular and culture are more or less interchangeable words. I'll give you a very simple example of it. There's a very famous book by Sigmund Freud, which many of us use or recommend to our students, which is called Civilization and Its Discontents. Now, some of you would be aware of the fact that the German title, in fact, does not have the word civilization at all in it. The word in German in the title is Kultur. So, in fact, what has actually happened is that in the whole notion which is over there, which is that of a civilization in crisis with in the kind of interwar period and so on and so forth, what you're actually having is an idea where culture and civilization, as I said, are interchangeable concepts. However, as we move to the use of civilization then in the plural, we come to a rather different set of problems. And I believe that, in a way, the crucial issue, and it's an issue which is, I will admit, more present in some writers than in others, and I'll just give you a quick listing of those who use this concept in a more or less rigorous way. The idea of civilization, in fact, is essentially intended, when used in the plural, to make arguments about autonomous development. That's essentially, I think, what its analytical bite is, to the extent that it has one. So what do I mean by this? Now, for instance, some of you would be aware of the fact that Arnold Toynbee, for instance, was very fond of using the word civilization, for instance, in his book, Study of History. But if you actually read Toynbee, if one has the patience to do that, you will actually realize that this is the most unrigorous and sloppy use of the term that one can find. According to Toynbee, it's very unclear, but there are anything between 23 and 31 or 32 civilizations that must be accounted for, right? Because he's willing to use civilization almost for any sort of cultural ensemble that he's willing to find, right? So, of course, there are the civilizations of the ancient past. Then there are civilizations, which are to be found in let's say, the early modern world, and then there are the contemporary civilizations. There are failed civilizations. There are civilizations which are abortive civilizations. He has all kinds of subcategories, but eventually what we realize is that the word civilization doesn't really mean very much for him, nor is it really something on the basis of which he's willing to advance any kind of real argument. I mean, if one is willing to talk about, as he does, an Eskimo civilization and a Hindu civilization, you see that you're actually dealing with concepts which are really quite diverse from one another. Now, where does this problem of civilization as a kind of building of autonomous histories come to be seen fairly clearly? I'll give you a very simple example, which is a debate which took place in Europe over the last 8 or 10 years. I don't know whether all of you would be aware of it. Some of you perhaps would not, so I'll just set it out for you. This was a book, it was around a controversy which took place around a book which was published then in French, which has a very obscure title, which is Aristote au Mont Saint-Michel, written by a French medievalist called Sylvain Guggenheim. And this book was essentially arguing that if you actually look at the roots of modern European civilization, these roots can be seen as firmly beginning with the Renaissance and with the 16th and the 17th century mostly, or perhaps the late 15th century. But here is the crucial thing. What Guggenheim wanted to argue was that, contrary to what he perceived as a wrong and politically correct consensus which had developed over the intermediate years, in fact, this civilization had a direct relationship to the pre-Christian and in particular Greek past. And what is actually particularly important is his argument that this was an unmediated relationship. what do we mean by an unmediated relationship? He wanted to argue that the quote-unquote politically correct view is that Greek knowledge passed to the Europe of the Renaissance through Muslims. And what Guggenheim was arguing was there was no Muslim intermediation. That the idea of Muslim intermediation was entirely a myth. And in fact, very few texts, according to him, actually got translated from Greek into Arabic and then from Arabic into, let's say, Latin. And in fact, according to him, and this is where Mont Saint-Michel comes into it, in a certain number of monasteries in Western Europe, ancient knowledge was actually preserved, and therefore the Renaissance was nothing else than a direct recovery. And so there is actually no need to go through another space, which is a space which takes you across the Mediterranean, or perhaps not even across the Mediterranean, because indeed, as we can see, here is the other extreme, the book by Maria Rosa Menocal called The Ornament of the World, which is actually making exactly the counter-argument, which is, for instance, it's a popular book, but nevertheless it's a very interesting book, which is talking about how in Spain, between, let's say, the 8th and the 14th or the early 15th century, in fact, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian knowledge was typically extremely mixed up, and in any of the major courtly centers, in particular of southern Iberia, but even to an extent of northern Iberia, there was really no separation between these knowledges. And in fact, that if you go to many of the major works, in fact, it's quite amusing to find how a certain number of works which were initially identified as being written by Christian authors have subsequently been found to have been written either by Jewish or by Muslim authors. So, in fact, you even see that it's sometimes not possible on the basis of the fragment of a text to even divine what the religious affiliation of somebody in fact is. So you actually had a debate. My colleague Alain de Libera and many others wrote extremely strong and violent responses to the book of Guggenheim. But what was actually really interesting was the fact that somebody wanted to make this argument in a particular context, which is a context, of course, in which in contemporary Europe and in contemporary France, there is this whole question of the Turks. Do the Turks belong to the European Union? Do they not belong to the European Union? This is the famous Le Monde cartoonist Plantu, who here is showing, this is the moment of the demonstrations in Taksim and so on, where you have Erdogan, who is hosing down the Europeans and saying, oh, you refuse to allow me to have a cultural exception. Which, of course, is because the French at the same time were arguing that for certain cultural production purposes, they wanted a cultural exception. Right? So the question is, what sort of cultural exception is and is not admitted? And the point, of course, which is being made over here is very much one where, for some people, Europe is essentially, whether it is said openly or sotto voce, is a Christian space. It is a Christian space which can at best be opened to the weak elements of Orthodox Christianity. That's about as far as you can go. For instance, let's say it can go as far as Ukraine. But it should certainly not, for instance, go, for instance, into Turkey, no matter how complex the whole relationship between the Turks and secularism is. Right? But this is really the frontier of Europe, because to open Europe up to this is to actually renege on what many people consider to be the European project, which is a civilizational project. It's a project about defining a space for a civilization, and therefore these are not people who should be let into that space. And Guggenheim, of course, was very much actually participating in precisely that kind of civilizational identitarian politics. Now, of course, we can argue that there are, again, historical roots to this. We could, for instance, very easily argue that this goes back at least as far as Piren's famous book, for instance, on Mahomet and Charlemagne, in which he argued that, in a sense, the rise of Islam, in a way, created a sort of a wall which separated the Muslims from the Christians, that this had economic consequences in terms of demonetization of Europe and so on and so forth, but that at the same time it also had consequences for the two knowledge systems, the separation of them, and so on and so forth. Again, we know that Piren was contested almost from the very beginning, but nevertheless, it's a paradigm which has an extremely important life and an important afterlife, and it has very important popular resonances, because we know, for instance, that this actually goes back to a reworking of very important medieval European myths. For instance, many of you would recognize this figure here, which is of course, the figure of St. James, but not the St. James that you might know from the Anglicans or from the Protestants. This is St. James of Santiago, as the figure who apparently managed not only to be present with Jesus Christ, but wound up being buried in Compostela in the northern part of Spain. And not only managed to be buried in the northern part of Spain, but managed in the process to wind up being a key figure in killing Muslims. How exactly this happened chronologically is an interesting question, but this is the reason why when the Iberians went to Asia, and when they went to Latin America, the battle cry, for instance, if you were one of the soldiers of Cortés or of Pizarro, you would have been having Santiago as Matamoros, as the killer of Muslims on your side. Right? That would have been, in some sense, what your Christianity was partly about. And so this is actually also, you might say, the reworking of the ideology of the Reconquest, which is being, in a way, reaffirmed over here. Now, I want to make it clear, incidentally, very quickly passing over this development, that I find it interesting that in the 16th century or in the 17th century, not every European intellectual was so sure about this way of going about things or about the impermeability between civilization spaces. I want to just give you one example, which is the official Portuguese chronicler, João de Barros, who actually wrote a book called Da Ásia, on Asia, which is a very long chronicle, actually makes the argument that if you want to understand what is really happening in the Portuguese encounter with Asia, the place where you have to begin is, and this is where he does begin, is with Muhammad. And is with the foundation of Islam, with the foundation of the Caliphate, with the expansion of the Caliphate into Iberia. And that is his chronology, right? So that's his notion of how things begin. And he's certainly quite clear that while there are oppositional elements, there are also clear elements of mixture. Now, this sort of tradition, which certainly exists and is very present, as I said, from the 16th century onwards, by the late 17th century is also increasingly being counterbalanced by a quite different European tradition, which I think becomes a tradition which is more and more dominant in the 18th century. Now, I don't want to join the long list of those who have subscribed to attack the Enlightenment in all its manifestations, but it must be said that if you actually look to not the later Enlightenment, but actually to the early and the radical Enlightenment, there are very interesting texts which are produced there. For instance, here is a text which belongs to a whole genre, which is actually the genre which uses this term conformité, which are actually these comparative texts. So this is a text, for instance, written by someone who's essentially drawing on Jesuit writings from China. There are several corresponding texts for China, for Japan, and for India, and where there is a kind of a comparison, and the whole project is structural and comparative, which is here to compare Chinese ceremonies with Greek and Roman idolatry. There are various aspects over here which are interesting. One is, of course, the typical move to compare the contemporary elsewhere with the ancient where you come from, which is what I would, of course, refer to as the Johannes Fabian syndrome, right? So the question of having time and space being substitutable in some sense. But something which is also very interesting over here is the idea that there are these very distinct spaces and complexes that are describable, comparable, and impermeable.
What date is this?
This is an edition from 1700, if you look below, but actually the text itself dates to about the 1680s. I think the first edition would date then. Now, this is a kind of a perspective, this kind of strong structural perspective, which beginning, I think, in the 17th century, continues to have a hold until much, much later. I'll give you an example of it without going into too much detail, and I apologize for the quality of the image. This is Kirti Chaudhry's book, Asia Before Europe, written in the late 1980s, and which has as a subtitle, Economy and Civilization in the Indian Ocean from the Rise of Islam to 1750. Now, Chaudhry, who ostensibly derives his theoretical apparatus from Brodel, and particularly from the 3 volumes of the Material Civilization, etc., in fact, is located epistemologically quite elsewhere. He actually is located in a very, very strange space where he is, on the one hand, ostensibly genuflecting towards certain kinds of postmodernist materials, but in fact is very strongly located in a structural understanding of what civilization is. Now, he tells us effectively that the Indian Ocean for about 1,000 years is characterized by 4 civilizations. Right? And what are these 4 civilizations? They are Islam, India, which he very easily slides into calling Sanskritic civilization, which is a very interesting slip, or perhaps it's not a slip at all. Then there's China, and then finally there is Southeast Asia. And I'll come back to Southeast Asia because it is the embarrassing category finally, more embarrassing even than the others. Now, he tells us effectively, so he has this introductory section to his book where he tells us about Islam, which is the usual story, of course, mentioning but eventually eliding over the fact that there are many distinctive forms of Islam, there are doctrinal differences which are quite radical, and very often, the different states within so-called Dar al-Islam had many greater conflicts than they had with their neighbors who were outside of it. No matter. There's the problem of India, where he assumes, very interestingly, that all of India is Sanskritic, which is a very interesting problem. But he also assumes something else, which is an interesting problem, which is he assumes that all that is Sanskritic is in India, which is quite another issue, which is a question which I'll again come back to. But many of you who know, for instance, the work of Sheldon Pollock would know that very clearly and correctly, to my mind, he has made an argument that if historically there was something called what he terms as Sanskrit cosmopolis, it extended well into Central Asia and extended well into what we would call Southeast Asia. So, in fact, these two ideas are not at all congruent. Then there's the problem of China, which is a whole other problem, because Chaudhuri, in fact, is not willing to deal with the usual issues which always embarrass us: what to do with the Western regions, what to do with differences, both religious differences and differences in terms of ethnicity, even within the space of, let's say, certainly the eastern segment of what is today China. But the real interesting question is, as I said, what he does with Southeast Asia. Because he tells us, and this is very curious and interesting, he tells us that the general argument that Southeast Asia should occupy a separate logical space for the purpose of comparative history on the same level as Islam, India, and China is open to debate. What is not questionable is the strong contemporaneous awareness of a series of separate identities to be perceived and seen in a world of islands and sea, in rivers and mountains. Not very sure what all of this means. It's certainly true that there were terms which were used in the 16th century. The term, for instance, Zirwadat was used. The land below the winds was used from the perspective of people in West Asia. But does this actually endow Southeast Asia with a civilizational collective identity? It's an interesting question. It's a question which has been debated from the time of John Smale's essay from the 1960s on writing an autonomous history of Southeast Asia, which I think is a completely insane project. An autonomous history of Southeast Asia. Can you imagine that? And it continues with Anthony Reid's attempt to define Southeast Asia as a region where he falls back at some time on an idea of a common Austronesian heritage, sometimes on food habits, sometimes on all kinds of notions of common popular culture, funerary rites, etc., but eventually is unable to actually tell us why Southeast Asia was not a category which was actually defined for the purposes of military commands in the Second World War, and why it is actually something which goes back for hundreds, if not thousands of years before that. Now, of course, Chaudhuri continues to tell us various things about how in Southeast Asia, in historical situations, a single structure with a continuum lying between an outer and inner limit often contained multiple relations between identical elements defined by more than one principle, just as a single function could perform more than one role. If you understand all of this, you're a better man than me, Gandharv. Now, but the interesting thing over here is precisely then that while we can actually see in these different notions here all kinds of ideas being played out, for instance, in the case of Islam, people will often fall back on notions of network, notions, for instance, of pilgrimage, that there is, for instance, an idea of pilgrimage to Mecca which has a sort of a unifying function. So that's one kind of a notion of what the definition is of a dispersed society, but which is nevertheless held together. There are all kinds of awkward questions. I mean, for instance, when we think of India, this Sanskritic civilization, this is a great text of the Sanskritic civilization, which is the Mahabharata. But this is the version written in Persian. And it is not the version written in Persian for some luxury consumption. It is now clear that if you actually go to a wide variety of northern Indian households in the 19th century, the fundamental access they had to texts like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana was to the Persian version. And it was in fact only the neo-Hinduism of the late 19th century and the 20th century which actually redefined them and which told them that civilizationally what they were doing was illegitimate, and that they must therefore withdraw from the use of these texts and come back to creating the critical edition of the Ur text in Sanskrit, and that this was the only legitimate text that really existed. Now, since time is running short, I must actually point to the fact that this has had very, very interesting consequences, not merely for the, let's say, ethnic and civilizational politics of these regions, because we have our own Sylvain Guggenheims in the context of South Asia and elsewhere. But actually what is also interesting is how this eventually becomes a part of standard, quote-unquote, scientific discourse on differences. Here, for instance, is maybe the great spokesman for civilizational difference of the 20th century, the French anthropologist Louis Dumont, about whom now quite a lot is known, including his very strange affiliations, essentially, to basically occult mysticism, through the figure, for instance, of René Guénon. But actually what is really interesting is this, and let me just briefly give you a sense of it. Dumont was somebody who started out actually working on the south of France, in the Tarasque. Then he worked on South India. He worked on the regions that speak Tamil in South India. He's worked on popular divinities like Ayanar and so on, who have very little actually to do with what is known as Sanskritic civilization. But what he then proceeded to do was to set aside this knowledge almost completely and reinvent a Hinduism, which is a Hinduism which is sort of based upon structural oppositions derived from a very derivative knowledge of what textual Hinduism was, and then which in a very interesting and second book that he wrote, and it's not only the strange cover of this book which is strange, the interior is even stranger. I don't know what this lady with the wet sari is doing on the cover of this book. But here is a book which is actually called La Civilisation Indienne et Nous, which is to say Indian civilization and us. So this means that the reader is us. Now, who is the reader who is supposed to be us? The reader is meant to be looking at this from the perspective of Western civilization. So what you're actually getting over here is a perspective in which Indian civilization is entirely different, entirely separated. And of course, what is often misunderstood is that Dumont is valorizing Indian civilization. He thinks that Indian civilization is much better than Western civilization. He thinks that all the processes of Western civilization, individuation, etc., are all wrong, that this should never have happened. Holism should have prevailed, as it apparently did in India. So he's actually positively valorizing Indian civilization, but this positive valorization is dependent on certainly 2 or 3 different separate strategies. One is an appeal only to the high tradition, and getting away even from his own past concerning the study of so-called popular traditions. This is one aspect of it. But what is actually really interesting is, and this was pointed out to me by one of his students who eventually broke with him, Marc Gaboriau, which is Dumont refused from the beginning of his career to the end of his career to discuss the question of Islam in India. Right? So for him, Islam did not exist in India. Or if it existed, it was an excrescence. So there was a certain sense in which those kinds of things were not supposed to happen. Why? Because every civilizational entity was meant to keep its purity, was meant to keep its structural stability. And this is the kind of work then, which I think now we have begun to move away from, which I mentioned to you the work of Sheldon Pollock not so long ago, which actually shows you that if you actually move away from the civilizational logic and ask much more concrete questions, for instance, take the use of Sanskrit as a language. not only as a religious language, but actually as a secular language. For instance, the question of mapping, let's say, the presence of Sanskrit in inscriptions of the medieval period. You can find Sanskrit inscriptions in Java, you can find them in Sumatra, on the Malay Peninsula, certainly in Cambodia, in Central Asia, etc. What does this mean? Does it mean that it is a civilization? No, it means it is a complex of elements which are being transmitted. It means that there are linguistic transformations which are taking place. None of you needs to have me tell you that, for instance, today Malay has a very substantial number of words that come from broadly, let's say, Sanskrit origins, as it has a smaller number of words that come from Tamil. Indian languages have borrowed words from Malay as well. And there are indeed these other forms of transmissions that you can find. So you can find these transmissions between India and, let us say, the Southeast Asia. You can equally find these very interesting complexes in which, say, for instance, here is Delhi, where an element from the 5th century or the 6th century has been incorporated into the space of a mosque. Right? Here is a mosque of the 13th century, again, which has incorporated elements that come from a very different religious and cultural complex, and so we can actually come to a notion which is very different from that of these separated and hermetically sealed silo-like civilizations in which there was so much interest. In fact, it's a matter of some interest that sometimes when you ask yourself, if you compare here, for instance, Prambanan in central Java to, let's say, Tanjore in southern India, the question does arise, and chronologically it has not been sufficiently adequately posed, of whether even the modes of transmission that we often imagine, because we often imagine that all of these things were done first in India and then in Southeast Asia, it may in fact have been the other way around. That monumental temple architecture may have in fact preceded some of the southern Indian examples, for instance, in the space of Java or in the space of Cambodia. Right, so let me conclude then. What I'm talking about here, of course, takes me back to someone who was an important person for me in various earlier moments in my career, who was a specialist of Southeast Asia, Denis Lombard, who wrote a very interesting and important book called Le Carrefour Javanais. Here you see the Bahasa Indonesia translation of it, and in which Lombard essentially argued that there is no point in looking at Southeast Asia as a civilization in that usual vocabulary. That, in fact, the whole point of dealing with Southeast Asian history is precisely the fact that it is, and the term he used was Carrefour. And, for instance, he often liked to refer to this whole region as Laut Tengah, the sea in between. Which is, of course, partly a genuflection to Brodel, who was a kind of master for him. But in fact, he completely subverted the Brodelian conception of what the Mediterranean was. It was no longer a received category, but it was actually a category which was playful and open. And since this is a meeting on the history of science, even though I will not refer to science, I will mention that at least it seems to be the recent works, even on South Asia, even by people coming from an Indological and Sanskrit background, have begun to move very much in this kind of direction. I don't always agree with everything which is said in these books. But here, for instance, is Sheldon Pollock's book on forms of knowledge in early modern Asia, which does a number of different things, which takes, for instance, Perso-Islamic traditions very seriously, which actually even opens up the question of Tibet. Is that to be treated as part of South Asia or not? Here, for instance, is a very different perspective by Jonardhan Ganeri, a philosopher, writing on India between the 15th and the late 17th century, where he actually talks about how exchanges between, let's say, 16th and 17th century Europeans and South Asians were much more interesting and much more ambivalent and complex than had been thought. So perhaps François Bernier should not be remembered only as someone who wrote about the Mughals, but as someone who brought Gassendi to the Mughals, but perhaps as someone who took something away from the Mughals, and whose whole conception, for instance, when he's writing about differences amongst human beings, as he does towards the end of his career, should actually be thought of as something which derives from South Asian knowledge traditions, which would again have been very complex traditions. He was, after all, employed by a Persian noble called Danishmand Khan, lived in Benares, certainly spoke to Persian-speaking Pandits in Banaras, so someone who had many of these aspects open to him. So to conclude then, what I'm actually trying to argue is that the civilization's paradigm, because of its investment in, as I said, purity and autonomy as its bywords, because of its decision that in some senses these complexes are separate. And here, I'm certainly not accusing Toynbee of this, because he didn't have such notions, but people who had much stronger notions of what civilization was useful for were, I think, much more heavily invested in it, and I think tended to forget that sometimes, for instance, when you go to a manuscript collection and you are given a book like this, say, if it doesn't have a colophon, you're actually left wondering, where does this come from? So, for instance, where does this come from? Here is a single painting which I think poses the problem squarely to us. This is the Sikandarnama. This is a version of the Adventures of Alexander, but not the usual Alexander. This is Iskandar Zulkarnain, the two-horned Alexander, who comes to us from the Persian tradition, but before that from the Syriac tradition, and who here is being shown in a manuscript produced in the Delhi Sultanate in the 15th century, right? To whom Iskandar is not the opponent of Darius, but his half-brother. Right? And so here then is a text which I think shows us that sometimes a bit of honest philology can take us away from the clash of civilizations.